A big question this election cycle is whether democratic socialism will be accepted by the American people, while Republicans have, of course, made a point to target socialism, flying socialism sucks banners and attacking the movement.
Here to weigh in on what this might mean for Bernie Sanders is the Democratic strategist Michael Starr Hopkins and Johnny Burtka. He's the executive director of the American Conservative. So, guys, I wanted to flag this very interesting article I saw yesterday from McClatchy. It was basically talking about how Scott Walker thinks that the biggest threat to Trump in rural Wisconsin is Bernie Sanders. Michael, I think this is very contra what a lot of the narratives here. And I mean, the discussion we should focus on is like with rural voters in particular. Why do you think that message is resonating?
Well, I think that one, there's a misunderstanding of kind of what socialism is, and it's become this kind of like flashpoint term that Republicans use to frame Democrats.
Right.
I mean, when you talk about Social Security, like that is a form of socialism in and of itself, and
military.
Medicare. Yeah, exactly. But when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren start talking about populism, that's what resonates, I think, in a lot of these Rust Belt towns and Rust Belt cities. And so I think it's the framing of it that I think really starts to get more support from Midwestern people.
And a big part of it, I really think, is not just the verbal backing of unions that you see from Bernie Sanders, but the physical, like, I've been there in the trenches. I was walking the picket line before it was cool. And especially at a time when you do have such massive inequality, when workers have so little power, that is a very appealing message, especially in these places that used to be Democratic strongholds on the power of labor unions and organizing, and have switched to Republicans because of cultural issues. That let's bring labor back, I'm going to stand with labor first message is very appealing.
Absolutely, and I'm from rural Michigan is where I grew up. So
oh,
I
really?
think, absolutely. I mean, so I think right now, people are rejecting the status quo on both sides of the aisle. They're sick and tired of income inequality, stagnant middle class wages, rising healthcare costs, rising education costs, and they're looking for someone who can take that on. They gave Donald Trump a turn in 2016, and we'll see who they give in 2020.
But that's the question, right, Johnny? Which is this is the great, because look, Scott Walker is the antithesis of that type of politics, right? He was basically thrown out because of it. So, I mean, one of the great fears I've talked about here on the show is that Republicans will talk and message all on this like socialism sucks, socialism, and they're going to lose, right? Because they're going to be like, we got to protect the job creators, and then they go out to the voters, and the voters are like, no, that's not what we're trying to vote here. I mean, how do they learn the right lesson going into 2020?
Well, I don't think they're learning the right lesson.
Make them learn it.
Yeah, I think we could probably name the people, the 30 people, the 40 people who have learned the lesson. After that, the rest, we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, and I think what we're starting to see is Democrats' message on corruption, and that was really successful in 2006 and 2010 on both sides. And so I think now what you're going to see is Democrats start talking about, if you have access to the president, then you can get rich. But if you're just a regular American trying to get by, then where's your help? Who's going to be your champion? Yeah. And that's not something Republicans are really talking about.
Right. I mean, I do think Hunter Biden is a little complicating for that message. Just in reality, it
but
is.
Nepotism in general, I think, when you have Rand Paul standing up talking about nepotism's bad, or Don Jr. talking about nepotism's bad, it has this tone-deaf kind of thing going on.
Right. But I think undersold in the realignment of some of these parts of the country, rural Michigan, where I used to live, in Rust Belt, Ohio, Kentucky, that we've been talking about a lot in the show, West Virginia, the other place I've worked in. I think really undersold in that is the reality of the policy decisions that Democrats made that hurt those parts of the country. I mean, it's always made out to be like sexism and racism, and I don't want to say that that's like zero part of the problem. I also think these things are deeply interconnected. But when you look at NAFTA, when you look at deregulating the banks, when you look at ending welfare, as you know, when you look at a concerted attempt to realign the Democratic Party around the professional managerial class, and not just the issue set that may be different culturally from these places, but the level of sort of contempt and condescension that has come from the party. And so in some ways, yes, I look at a piece, about Bernie Sanders and rural voters and why he's connecting and the issue areas and why there may be overlap. But I honestly think it's a lot simpler than that. He doesn't have this sense of sort of condescension towards these places. People feel like he really meets them at their level and like respects and hears what they're trying to say.
Yeah, and that condescension was shared by basically both parties for the since the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah. And cynically manipulated by Republicans, I should say, who would tell them what they wanted to hear on cultural issues and then basically sell them down the river. As Matt Bevin just found out, that eventually the gig is up.
Absolutely, and I think with Sanders, one of the things that people inside the Beltway bubble don't like is the fact that he doesn't put up with kind of the inside politics, kind of politeness, and I think that's actually going to work for him pretty well in these Rust Belt places,
right?
Because that lack of just bending to the will of the establishment doesn't really.
I love whenever
So true.
when the Washington Post freaks out because he's like, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos and it's a tool, and they're like, he's just like, and the rest of the people are like, yes, like
Yes, no, I mean,
love that about him.
That's the thing that you hear on Twitter all the time. Is he's not even a Democrat. It's
He's so gruff.
that's his strongest selling point. Like, go out and ask people in the country how they feel about the Democratic Party, and then watch Bernie Sanders trash them and say it's an existential threat and
Which
come
is
back
why
and talk
it's so
to me.
weird that you haven't heard Warren talk about her transition from being a Republican to a Democrat. Biden started talking about it, and for some reason thinks it's going to be a winning argument for him. But I think it actually will shore up some of her support.
Yeah, it's possible. I really don't know. I mean, speaking of unexpected results here, we hear that Bernie is outpacing every other 2020 Democrat in Latino fundraising support. This is really one of those stories where, like, if you watch CNN or if you watch a lot of these conventional news networks,
You would have no idea.
You would just have no idea that this is happening. And I think, Michael, it gets to what we're talking about here, which is that, talking to racial differentiated groups in terms of only racial politics it just does not work. And it's something that we consistently see within the race, which is that black support is consolidated around the top three white candidates, around Latino support now backing Bernie Sanders. I mean, ultimately, it's about class. That's what all of these politics are about, class going into this election.
And especially within the minority community, there's a real desire to make sure that we pick a candidate who can win because of the issues of immigration and building the wall, or issues of criminal justice and restoring the Voter Rights Act. And so I think that it's less policy-based in this election and more of how do we get a Democrat in the office to reverse kind of some of the Trump trends.
Well, and this was one of we've been talking a lot about these New York Times head-to-head swing state polls, which made Democrats go, oh my God, he could go reelected. Yeah, I know. One of the takeaways, though, was that Elizabeth Warren was underperforming Hillary Clinton dramatically with black and brown voters. So even after everything with Trump, even after build the wall, they're not sending their best people, rapists and murderers, whatever. Even after all of that, it looks very much like if you nominate a Democrat like Elizabeth Warren, you could be in position to lose ground with Latinos against Donald Trump.
I definitely think so. And according to that New York Times poll that was released earlier this week, you saw Elizabeth Warren did significantly worse than both Bernie and Biden in the 6 states that were closest one.
I think there was one
Republicans.
exception, which was Arizona.
Okay.
Even. It was
even. Okay. Yeah. So.
I mean, we'll see. I think some of that also has to do with just the shuffling of support, being that Biden, has such a huge block of support, and then Sanders has a built-in support that if one of them falters, that it'll naturally shift over. But I think it's kind of a waiting game of seeing how that first primary goes. Iowa's going to really set the stage for how the rest of the primary season goes.
Yep.
Yeah, I think so too.
Iowa, Biden could come in fourth. Not out of the realm of
could be worse than
possibility.
that.
It's crazy. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, stick with
Sit
us.
tight.
We got more we want to get to right after this.